Furniture and accessories, I often try to use the grain itself to kind of flow through the project. So if you have a whole bunch of drawer fronts, getting all that out of one board so it kind of just makes its own little picture when the thing is done is pretty cool. And then of course with things like small boxes like this, it's great if you could have the grain wrap around a corner. Now there's a lot of different ways you can approach this, but most of them just yield almost perfect results. And let me show you what would happen with a box if you just take the more simple approach. So let's say this is our board, we've got the grain running through it, and we're trying to cut this into pieces for a box. So oftentimes what we'll do is we'll make a few cuts. And the key is to simply keep these in order. As long as these two are always joined together, and these two are joined together, and these two, you can kind of wrap the grain around the box. But where this falls apart is here and here, because eventually these two ends need to connect to one another. And the chances of the grain on this part of the board matching the grain on this part of the board, it's impossible. They never will. So you often end up with a box that has 3 great wrapped sides and 1 bad side that you put back in the corner. Now here's a very special box that I made for a couple of friends recently, and look at that grain. It just goes all the way through. Every single corner, not just 3, all 4 corners are perfectly matched up with the grain. So it's going to be a little bit more work, and you do need material that is thick enough so you could resaw it in half, which means you're going to need a bandsaw to do it. If all that stuff is there though, this is definitely the way to go, because that effect on all 4 corners looks a whole lot cooler than just having one that you kind of have to hide in the back. So let me show you how I made it. A small box doesn't need super thick sides, so a rough 4/4 board should yield at least 2 3/8 inch pieces. I lay out the center line for the resaw and then mark out my cross-cut locations, being careful to allow for the blade kerf. And notice that these cross-cuts will take place after the resaw. Now don't skimp on this layout step, you really need to keep track of the parts after the cut, so trust me, do it! Right, so we go A, we D, D, C, A, B, B, C. Here's a final look at the layout that you'll want to copy. It might not make sense yet, but keep watching. Oh, and because I like to build suspense, I'm writing in to denote the inside face of the box, because ultimately the current outside face of the board will eventually become the inside of the box. The board first gets a resaw right down the middle. The cleaner the cut, the better, since we're trying to remove as little material as possible. That's part of the reason that it's best to use a thin bandsaw blade instead of something like a table saw, which has a much thicker kerf. In woodworking, we usually call this book matching. So if you saw down the middle and open it up like the pages of a book, you end up with something that's really a nice mirror image where the grain looks almost exactly the same on both sides. In this case, for what we're doing, we're actually going to go more of an end-to-end book match. So if you take these pieces like so, you can see how the grain just kind of travels right on through. And we want to minimize the amount of material we take off of this face, as well as minimize the amount of material we saw away when we make that cut, because as you travel through the thickness of the board, the grain moves and it changes. So in order to retain that illusion, we have to retain as much material as possible. In fact, let me show you what this looks like if I just take a little bit extra off of this piece. Here's the piece I cut. Let's see what we did. So you still have a decent mirror image there. It's not perfect. You can see it's starting to deviate a little bit, but let's look at this. This is the one that matters in the context of this project. It's pretty far off now, right? Those do not look like a perfect match, right? And that was just by removing an extra 1/8 of an inch off of this piece. So that drives home the point. We really want to be careful how much material we remove from that inside face. With that in mind, I'll joint the inside faces very lightly. By the way, remember I said before that the outside of the board becomes the inside of the box? Well, that also means that the inside of the board will become the outside of the box, and that's why we're jointing the inside face first, retaining the grain position on the visible faces. Any planing that we need to do will be on what will eventually be the inside face of the box, where we don't have to worry about the grain match. Now I can cut the pieces into the various box sides using the layout lines from the first step. And if you're paying attention, you probably realize that the 1/8 inch blade kerf works against us by removing material at our joint lines. But in some cases, there's only so much we can do. Making these cuts at the bandsaw would certainly be an option if you've got really wild grain where that 1/8 of an inch could cause you problems. Okay, so here's where the magic happens. This is the orientation of the parts where they lived in the original full solid board. We're just going to take the top two and place them on the other side. Now, what was the inside of the board becomes the outside of our box.
Cool. Very cool.
Now at each corner, I recommend drawing your bevel cut lines. This is easy to show, but kind of hard to explain, so just do what I'm doing and you'll be fine. And now let's check all four corners to make sure that we have what we think we have. And they're all nearly a perfect match. Okay, so now for the bevel cuts. I like to use the miter saw with the head tilted to 45 degrees. And I also like to use stops. They help keep the piece the right length, but also help stabilize the work. But the real key here is to double check the lines that we drew before, making sure that we're cutting in the correct orientation. And by the way, if you want to know what joint in woodworking I dislike the most, you're looking at it. I honestly hate doing long bevels. Short ones, not too bad, but long ones, not my favorite. So from here, it's just basic box making stuff. We're going to cut ourselves a little box bottom and then cut the grooves for it at the table saw. This isn't really something I'd bother using a dado stack for, just a couple of passes at the table saw will do the trick. Oh, it's the best! While we're here, I may as well make the cuts for the box top. We'll make a rabbet for the top to drop down into. Now sometimes when you make a rabbet like this, you might have some cleanup to do, and a shoulder plane will work great for that. So my box bottom is oversized, and I can use the box sides to tell me the final dimensions. Should do it. Just a little tip, when your parts are sized for a snug fit, it's a good idea to chamfer the edges to help avoid tearing out the grain. So the box bottom gets a little love for my sweet baby brass plane. Love that thing. Now, a little test fit. Okay, so now's our chance to do any sanding that we want to do on the inside face because we're getting ready to glue it up. B, B, A to A, D to D, and then C to C. A cool technique for bringing a miter box together is to stretch some masking tape across the joints on the outside face. I like to use a piece of scrap to help keep the pieces in line. The last corner will get taped after the glue is added. And when you do a bit of a dry assembly to test it out, you should feel some resistance getting that last joint closed. That means that we've got
too much tape?
No, we got a nice amount of tape. I'll drop some tight bond into the groove and onto the bevel joints. And with the bottom in place, we can just bring everything together, making sure all the joints are nicely seated. Sometimes the tape is all you need. Other times the glue up can benefit from supplemental clamping. Now regular clamps are going to be tricky to use in this context, so if you can get yourself some band clamps like these Merrill clamps, you'll be better off. I'll put a link in the description as I highly recommend picking one up.
It is so choice.
Now make sure you clean up any squeeze out with a putty knife or a chisel and then a wet rag. In the case of an urn, the box will be sealed up so we don't have to get too crazy worrying about the inside, but I can't send this thing out with glue squeeze out, so I'm cleaning it up. One of the reasons why I don't like doing joints like this is because there's nearly always at least one corner with a fine gap that you need to contend with. You can certainly use filler if you want, but one cool trick is to actually deform the wood slightly using a screwdriver or anything with a smooth shaft. If you apply a nice even pressure at a shallow angle, you can sort of crush the fibers at the corner, causing them to push into the gap. We're talking small amounts here, not big gouges. Now, this isn't a perfect fix, but it's one that can make you feel better about a less than perfect appearing joint. Another option is to make your own filler using some sawdust from the project wood and a little bit of glue. Just keep in mind that if you are staining the wood, the repair won't accept stain. Now we can sand the outside of the box. Don't go nuts with a powered sander because if you spend too much time at a corner, you might really mess up the appearance of the joint. Now to help strengthen the joints and add a little spag flare,
we need to talk about your flare.
We'll cut 2 splines in each corner. To do that, I'll use a little spline cutting jig. I actually made this jig for my award-winning, world-renowned, and still available in many stores book, Essential Joinery. Pick up a copy at twwstore.com today. We don't want the splines to show on the inside of the box, so I'll make some measurements and set the blade height on the jig and then test in a piece of scrap. To get the best results, you'll want to use a blade with a square ground tooth. Alternating bevel blades will leave an irregular surface. The splines themselves will be made from Macassar ebony. I'll get the rough shape and then cut the oversized triangles at the bandsaw. Watch those little piggies. I then use a putty knife to put glue into the slots and on the splines, and then press them into place. Just keep in mind that if the fit is tight without glue, it's going to be nearly impossible to insert the splines with glue because the wood expands from the moisture. So size them appropriately and don't be afraid to run some clamps from corner to corner, gluing up a couple at a time. I'm on a tight timetable, so boom, splines in the house. While the splines dry, I'll mill up some stock for the lid. Really nothing fancy here, just another attractive piece of maple with some spalting. I cut the lid to size and then fine-tune the fit with a hand plane. If your box is slightly out of square at this point, this is a good way to sneak up on the perfect fit, even if the angles aren't perfectly square. While the lid sits down in the rabbet, I'm going to add an additional rabbet to the lid itself, and I'll cut those at the table saw. By the way, notice on these rabbets that I'm using a sacrificial fence. You pretty much need to when the blade is this close to the fence. And when you have a metal fence on a saw-stop table saw, that's a recipe for a very expensive wall ornament. So you need to be careful. With the double rabbet, we should have a nice, satisfying drop-in fit. And now for a decorative bevel on the top perimeter. Okay, back to those splines. I'll use a flush trim saw to cut the excess and then sand to remove the glue residue. And any of the sharp edges are broken with sandpaper. Now let's drop in the lid. Looks pretty good. Obviously, you can use any finish you like. I've been using a lot of this stuff lately. It's called Bumbleshoots, and it's a food-safe mix of tongue oil and citrus solvent. You can actually get 10% off using my code TWW10 at checkout. The oil really brings out the beauty in the maple. You just wipe it on thin and wipe off the excess. For something like a box that's mostly decorative, a couple of coats should do the trick. So obviously, quite a bit more work involved, but I totally think it's worth it. Sometimes the average person, you can't really tell what they're going to notice with things like this, but I think when you put this level of time and effort into a project and you have that much pride in your work, it's worth it to do the extra mile if you can, if you've got the thickness of material you would need and the tools to do it. Totally worth it. So thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time. So you go all the way around just by reversing the inside and the outside. So
How'd you teach me that?
we call that the Texas wrap,
Texas wrap, because everything's big.
and no aluminum foil involved. Huh? You having a conversation with Todd?
Nope.
You know he's not here, right?
Oh, he's here.
Always watching.
I'd like to file a report. Against who? My mother? She's supposed to be the head of HR? Why'd she curse at me so much?
Okay.
Why, Todd?